The desert wind howled across the empty plains, carrying with it the taste of dust and loneliness. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, cracked red earth, scattered sagebrush, and the faint shimmer of heat rising off the horizon like a mirage. The sun was sinking, bleeding orange and crimson across the sky, and every shadow seemed sharper than the last. It was the kind of evening when a man could feel the weight of the whole world pressing down on him. Jake Sullivan stood at the edge of his fence line, hat pulled low against the dying light. At 32, his face was lined from years of hard sun and harder living. His hands were rough, his back tired, but everything he owned stood before him. 20 head of cattle, a dozen horses, a leaning barn, and a small cabin with smoke curling faintly from the chimney. It wasn't much, but it was his. He'd built it with his father and brother before sickness took them both. His mother had followed soon after, her heart giving out from sorrow. Jake buried her alone behind the house, the last of his family gone. Now he lived with only the wind and the horses for company. The quiet suited him. Or at least, that's what he told himself. As the sky darkened, thunder rolled low across the plains. He turned his gaze north and saw it. A wall of storm clouds climbing over the hills, black and alive with flickering light. He'd seen plenty of storms, but something about this one made the hairs on his neck rise. The horses in the corral stomped and whinnied, restless and uneasy. "Easy now," Jake muttered as he pushed through the barn doors. Inside, the air smelled of hay and rain-soaked dust. He moved quickly, checking every stall, making sure the animals were secure before the storm hit. His favorite stallion, a black Mustang he called Midnight, tossed its head nervously. Jake ran a steady hand down the animal's neck. "It's just a bit of thunder, boy. We've weathered worse." A crash split the sky open, lightning bright enough to turn the world white for a heartbeat. The wind hit next, slamming into the barn so hard the wooden beams groaned. Rain followed in wild, heavy sheets, hammering against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Jake had just turned to reach for the feed cover when a sound rose above the storm, the faintest voices, half lost to the wind. He froze, his hand drifting to the Colt. .45 holstered at his hip. No one should be out in this kind of weather. No one sane anyway. The voices came again. Closer this time. Then the barn doors burst open, banging hard against the walls as 3 figures stumbled inside. The lamplight caught them, 3 women, drenched to the bone, clothes torn, and faces pale with exhaustion. Jake didn't lower his gun. "Please," the eldest said, voice trembling but strong. "We just need shelter from the storm. We mean no harm." She looked to be in her late 20s, tall and sharp-eyed despite the cold. Wet strands of dark hair clung to her face, and her green eyes carried a fierceness that made Jake hesitate. Behind her stood a second woman, maybe 25, with auburn curls and a guarded expression. The third was the youngest, barely 20, clutching her sister's arm, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. "You're a long way from town," Jake said finally, keeping his tone even. The eldest nodded. "We've been riding since morning, lost the trail in the storm." Jake studied them a long moment. Everything about them screamed trouble. The torn dresses, the exhaustion, the way the eldest kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to follow. But no one deserved to be left out in weather like this. "There's hay in the loft," he said at last, jerking his head toward the ladder. "It's dry. You can wait the storm out there." Relief flickered across her face. "Thank you." "Name's Jake Sullivan," he said, still watching them carefully. Here's my place." The woman hesitated. "I'm Margaret. These are my sisters, Rose and Catherine." Jake didn't believe those were their real names, but it wasn't his business. "There's a water pump out back," he said. "I'll fetch some blankets and food." He turned before they could argue, pushing out into the rain. By the time he reached the house, he was soaked through. He grabbed every blanket he could find, along with some bread, dried beef, and his mother's old medicine box, just in case. When he returned to the barn, the women were huddled in a corner, the youngest crying softly, while the other 2 tried to comfort her. Margaret looked up sharply when he entered, her green eyes wary until she saw what he carried. "Here," Jake said, setting the supplies down nearby. "There's food and bandages if you need 'em." "We can't take your things," Margaret began. "You can, and you will," Jake said firmly. "Storm like this, you'd freeze before dawn without dry blankets." For a long moment, she just looked at him, testing his sincerity. Then she nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." He tipped his hat slightly. "Jake'll do fine." The middle sister, Rose, watched him with a strange, unreadable expression. "Think you can handle us all?" she asked, half teasing, half challenging. Jake almost smiled despite himself. "Reckon I can manage." Quote. Thunder shook the walls again, and the youngest, Catherine, flinched, pressing closer to her sisters. Jake adjusted the barn door, securing it tighter against the wind. When he turned back, he caught sight of Margaret's hands, knuckles scraped, dried blood caked along her fingers. Those were fighting wounds, running wounds. "You can stay till morning," he said quietly. "Storm won't pass before then." Margaret met his gaze. "We'll be gone at first light." Jake didn't argue, but he knew she was lying. He climbed to the loft, checking for leaks, making sure it was dry enough for them to sleep. When he came back down, the three sisters were already wrapped in blankets, sharing the food like people who hadn't eaten properly in days. "I'll be in the house," Jake said as he reached the door. "You need anything, call out." "Mr. Sullivan," Margaret called softly. He turned. The lamplight flickered over their faces, pale, weary, but alive. "Thank you," she said simply. Jake nodded once and stepped into the storm again. Inside his cabin, he lit the fire and sat by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the barn. He told himself he was just being cautious, watching for thieves or strangers, but deep down he knew better. Something about those three women was about to change everything. And as the thunder rolled over the desert, Jake Sullivan realized he might not be as alone as he'd thought. Dawn broke bright and clean, the storm leaving behind a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The land steamed with new life, mud replacing dust, puddles shimmering like glass in the morning light. Jake stepped out of the house, stretching his sore shoulders, the smell of wet earth thick in the air. The storm had passed, but the unease in his chest had not. He made his way toward the barn, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. From inside came the sound of movement. Soft voices, the gentle clink of metal buckets, the low murmur of women working. When he opened the door, he found the sisters already awake. Margaret was brushing down a mare, sleeves rolled to her elbows, revealing bruises along her arms. Rose was mucking out stalls with surprising skill, her auburn curls tied back in a loose braid. Catherine was scattering feed, speaking softly to each horse like she was whispering secrets to them. "You know horses," Jake said quietly, not quite making it a question. Margaret glanced up, a weary smile flickering across her face. "We grew up around them." He nodded, watching how easily they moved, how naturally they fell into the rhythm of ranch work. It was clear they weren't helpless travelers. These were women who'd worked, survived, and endured. By noon, the barn looked better than it had before the storm. Even Catherine, despite her fragile frame, worked without complaint. Jake couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. "You'll stay for dinner?" he said as they finished cleaning up. It wasn't a question. Margaret started to refuse. "We've imposed enough." "We're hungry, Maggie," Rose interrupted bluntly, wiping sweat from her brow. "And he's offering." Quote. Margaret sighed, but gave in. "All right, but just one meal." Jake gestured toward the house. "Wash up at the pump first." "I'll get the fire going." Inside, he prepared what he could: beans, salt pork, and some potatoes that had seen better days. The sisters hesitated at the door before stepping inside. They looked around the small cabin. Plain wooden furniture, a fireplace, a single table, and 2 doors leading to small rooms. Catherine's eyes lingered on the bookshelf by the window. "You read?" she asked softly. "When there's light enough," Jake replied, stirring the pot. "You can borrow one if you like." Her face lit up, a rare smile softening her features. "Thank you." "She loves books," Rose said as she sat down heavily in a chair. Used to read to us every night when we were little. Before. Rose, Margaret warned sharply, but her sister fell silent. The tension that followed was heavy, filled with words unsaid. Jake didn't press. He had learned long ago that on the frontier, everyone carried ghosts. "Smells good," Rose said after a while, trying to lighten the mood. "Don't thank me yet," Jake said with a small grin. "It's just beans and pork." They ate quietly, the clinking of spoons and the crackle of fire the only sounds for a while. Jake noticed how Margaret made sure her sisters ate first before taking any herself. Rose ate like she was starving, though she tried to hide it. Catherine took small bites, lost in thought. When they'd finished, Jake leaned back in his chair. "There's a town 2 days east. Millfield. Sheriff, there's a decent man. If you're in trouble—" "No law," Margaret cut in sharply. "We just need to keep moving. Find work. Start over." "What kind of work?" Jake asked. "We can cook, mend, clean," Margaret said. "Rose knows horses better than most men." Jake nodded slowly. "And you?" he asked Catherine. She ducked her head. "I can teach reading and writing. Used to give lessons back home." The shape of their story began to form in his mind. 3 sisters running from something, maybe someone. He pushed his chair back. "Storm did a number on my fences and garden. I could use some help. Room and board in exchange." Margaret frowned. "Why would you offer that to strangers?" "Because I've got too much work for one man," he said simply. "And because everyone deserves a fair start." The sisters exchanged looks. Rose's eyes softened, but Margaret's narrowed. "We can't stay long. It's not safe." "Not for you." "I'll take my chances," Jake said. Rose suddenly stood. "Maggie, let's talk outside." She grabbed her sister's arm and dragged her toward the door. Catherine stayed behind, hands folded in her lap. Through the window, Jake could see them arguing, Rose gesturing wildly, Margaret trying to calm her. After a moment, Catherine said quietly, "They're trying to protect you." Jake looked at her. "From what?" She hesitated, then whispered, "From what follows us." He leaned forward. "What follows you, Catherine?" Her voice trembled. "Evil. The kind that wears a fine suit and smiles like a gentleman. The kind that owns everything and everyone." Before Jake could ask more, the door opened. Rose looked frustrated, Margaret pale but composed. 3 days, Margaret said firmly. "We'll work for 3 days, then move on." Jake nodded. "Fair enough." That night, the sisters took the spare room, his parents' old room, while Jake stayed by the fire. Sleep didn't come easily. The storm might have passed, but the air still felt heavy with something unseen. Sometime after midnight, he stepped outside for air. The ranch was quiet, bathed in moonlight. Then he heard it. Faint voices coming from the barn. He moved closer, careful not to make a sound. "Can't keep running forever," Rose was saying. Her tone was angry but tired. "Maggie, we're worn down. Katie can barely stay on her feet." "And what would you have me do?" Margaret snapped. "Wait for him to find us." "You know what he'll do." "Maybe we should have stayed and fought," Catherine said softly. "Fought?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Against a man like that? The law's his. The sheriff's his. We'd be dead already." Jake's heart tightened. He didn't know who he was, but he knew enough to understand fear when he heard it. Then Rose spoke again. "We should tell him." "No," Margaret said instantly. "The less he knows, the safer he is." "You think Morrison cares about that?" Rose shot back. "He'll burn this place down when he finds us here." Morrison. The name hit Jake like a spark catching dry tinder. He knew that name, a land baron from the next county over, known for using money and fear to get what he wanted. Jake shifted slightly, but his boot scraped against the dirt. The voices stopped. "Who's there?" Margaret called sharply. He heard the click of a gun hammer being drawn back. "Easy," Jake said, stepping into the moonlight. "Just me." Margaret appeared in the doorway, a pistol in hand. Her eyes were hard, suspicious. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," Jake said quietly. "Morrison, that's who you're running from." Margaret's jaw clenched. Behind her, Rose and Catherine stood pale in the lamplight. "You should forget what you heard," Margaret said. "Go back inside." Jake met her gaze steadily. "Can't do that." "Then you don't understand what you're getting into," Rose said, stepping forward. "He's not a man, he's a monster." Jake's expression hardened. Then maybe it's time someone stopped him. "Why would you risk your life for us?" Margaret demanded. Jake's voice was low, certain. "Because someone has to, and I reckon I'm done watching men like Morrison take what they please." The three sisters stood silent in the barn doorway, moonlight shining off their tear-streaked faces. For the first time, Jake saw it clearly. They weren't just strangers needing shelter, they were survivors of something terrible. And now, whether he liked it or not, their fight had become his too. The next morning dawned too quiet. The air felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Jake stood on the porch with his rifle, scanning the horizon. The sisters worked silently, each one moving with a nervous edge that hadn't been there the day before. Whatever piece they'd found on his ranch was hanging by a thread. By midday, the stillness broke. A dust cloud rose from the far ridge. 5 riders coming hard and fast. Jake's gut tightened. He'd seen that kind of approach before. Organized, determined, dangerous. "Company," he called, already reaching for his rifle. Rose ran from the corral to his side, eyes sharp. "How many?" "5, he said grimly. "And they ride like they know where they're headed." "Get your sisters in the house," Jake ordered. "Now." Within minutes, the sisters were inside. Jake stood alone on the porch, rifle leveled, waiting. The riders slowed as they neared the fence line. Their leader was older, face like tanned leather, eyes cold as winter stone. "Afternoon," the man said, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Name's Garrett. I'm looking for 3 women." "Sisters. Heard they might have passed this way." "Lots of folks pass through," Jake replied evenly. "Can't say I keep count." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "These 3 are special. Stole something from Mr. Harrison Morrison himself. Horses, money, maybe even killed one of his men." Jake's jaw tightened. "Sounds like trouble. Can't help you." "Maybe," Garrett said, leaning forward in his saddle. "Mind if we look around?" "I do mind." Jake's tone stayed calm, but the rifle never wavered. 2 of the men dismounted, heading for the pump. The others spread out slowly, trying to look casual but keeping hands near their guns. Garrett's eyes drifted toward the house. Big place for one man. Jake's grip on the rifle tightened. It's enough. Then the front door creaked open behind him. Jake's heart sank as Margaret stepped out, calm as a Sunday morning. She walked straight to his side, chin held high. "These men bothering you, husband?" she asked, her voice steady as stone. Jake blinked but didn't miss a beat. "Just passing through, dear." Garrett's eyebrows lifted. "Husband, huh?" Margaret smiled coolly. "That's right. This is our home. Now, if you're done trespassing, I suggest you move along." Before Garrett could reply, Rose appeared in the doorway, apron tied around her waist. "Maggie, the soup's burning," she said lightly. Then, turning to the riders with a sweet, dangerous smile, she added, "We having guests for dinner?" "Not today," Jake said firmly. The men shifted uneasily, confused by the scene. The hunted fugitives they were expecting looked more like settled ranch folk. From inside, Catherine began humming a hymn, her soft voice floating out into the yard. Garrett frowned, clearly uncertain. "How long you folks been here?" Margaret crossed her arms, long enough to know when men have overstayed their welcome. A muscle twitched in Garrett's jaw. He looked from Jake to the sisters, suspicion warring with doubt. Finally, he spat in the dirt. "You tell Morrison we checked, and if we find out you've been lying." Jake cut him off. "You'll have a long ride back to tell him." Garrett's eyes narrowed, but he turned his horse. "We'll be in the area. Don't do anything foolish." They rode off, but Jake watched one man glance back more than once. When they were finally gone, he let out the breath he'd been holding. "They'll be back," Margaret said quietly. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "But now we're ready." That evening, he showed them the hidden gun rack his father had built into the wall. 2 rifles, a shotgun, and enough ammunition for a small war. Rose handled the Winchester like it was an old friend. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" Jake asked. "Our father," she said, checking the sights. "He said no one would protect us if we didn't protect ourselves." Margaret's eyes hardened. Morrison saw to it our father didn't live long enough to prove that true. They fortified the ranch through the night, barricading windows, checking lines of fire, laying sandbags along the porch. Jake moved among them, silent but proud. They weren't frightened anymore. They were ready. By dawn, a new dust cloud appeared. Not 5 riders this time, but dozens. Morrison had come. Jake counted 40 men before he stopped trying. At their head rode a man in a black coat on a fine stallion. Even from a distance, his arrogance was clear. Harrison Morrison had arrived to finish what he started. He rode within shouting distance and cupped his hands. "Sullivan, I'm a reasonable man. Hand over those women and you live. Stand in my way and I'll burn you to the ground." Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "You've already taken enough from them. You're not taking anything else." Morrison laughed loud and cruel. "You think you can handle me and 40 men?" Jake's voice carried across the yard. "You'd be surprised what 4 people can do when they're fighting for their lives." A gunshot cracked the air. Morrison's men opened fire. Jake ducked back behind the post, returning fire as the sisters took their positions. Margaret covered the rear window. Rose, fierce and unyielding, took the barn loft. Catherine stayed low with the shotgun, reloading as fast as her trembling hands allowed. The battle raged like thunder. Bullets shattered windows, tore through wood, and filled the air with smoke. Rose dropped 2 men trying to flank the barn. Margaret fired with deadly precision from the back window. Catherine hit one who'd gotten too close to the porch, her face pale but determined. Jake moved from cover to cover, his rifle a steady rhythm of vengeance. When his bullets ran out, he grabbed the shotgun, taking down another attacker trying to breach the fence. "They're falling back!" Rose shouted from the loft. "Don't let up!" Jake yelled back. Then came the sound they'd all been praying for, the distant roar of more horses. Reinforcements. Through the smoke, Sheriff Thompson and a dozen deputies charged in, rifles blazing. Morrison's men broke, scattering like leaves in the wind. When the dust cleared, the yard was a ruin of gun smoke and silence. Rose limped from the barn, blood on her sleeve but smiling. Margaret stood beside Jake, breathing hard, her pistol empty. Catherine sat on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face but alive. Morrison, trapped and furious, tried to run. His horse went down under a deputy's bullet, pinning him to the ground. The sheriff approached, shotgun in hand. "Harrison Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, extortion, and more sins than I can name." Jake watched as they dragged him away in chains. The man who had ruled with fear, now cursing in the dirt like any other criminal. The ranch was quiet again, but the silence this time felt different. Not empty, but peaceful. The sisters stood together, arms around one another. "It's over," Catherine whispered. Jake shook his head softly. "No, it's just beginning." Weeks later, Morrison swung from the gallows in Millfield. His empire fell with him. The sisters stayed on, rebuilding the ranch alongside Jake. The land healed, the wounds faded, and laughter returned to the house. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun rose over the plains, Rose stood beside Jake on the porch. "Think you can handle us all now?" she asked with that same mischievous smile. Jake grinned, sliding an arm around her shoulders. "Reckon I already did." Inside, Margaret's laughter mixed with Catherine's singing as they prepared breakfast. The ranch that had once been silent now rang with life. The desert wind swept across the land, gentle this time, carrying away the last ghosts of fear and loss. Jake Sullivan had opened his door to 3 strangers in a storm and found a family strong enough to weather anything. They were home, together, forever.